Haswinar or known as Konar. So they will be giving a presentation for more or less 40 minutes or 45 minutes, and then you are welcome to ask questions or give comments afterward. As usual, as they're presenting, if you have burning questions, feel free to raise your hand and interrupt. During the question and answer, please identify yourself, where you're from, and then address your question. So without further ado, let me give the floor to our presenters for today.
Thank you, Iju Stacy. So as Stacy mentioned, Konar and I have been working for a while on this study, so we're eager to present it to you. The paper will be disseminated in about a month or two, probably a month and a half. So we're here to present our initial findings, and we're very eager for your feedback and suggestions as it's still being finalized. So as Stacy mentioned, the focus of our study is on informal risk management and vulnerability among 4 villages of Indonesia. I'll go over the background and motivation, and then I'll pass it on to Konar for the first section. But there's a lot of text on this screen, so I'll walk you through it. But essentially, we wanted to describe the ways in which, what motivated this study. Why did we choose to undertake a qualitative study looking at informal risk management vulnerability in these villages? So the poverty team, the team that both Konar and I work on, has been very successful in producing a lot of study looking at different aspects of these questions. So in 2006, we undertook a poverty assessment which looked at trying to understand the landscape of risks and shocks faced by the poor in Indonesia, and it used a quantitative approach to do so. In 2012, we did a really exhaustive review of social assistance in Indonesia through our program expenditure review, which I hope all of you have seen, and if not, we have extra copies as well. But that focus really revealed a lot of implementation challenges with the social assistance side, which began to help us understand how people address risks by using that one specific tool. In our paper, we call social assistance formal risk management. So through those 2 studies and other subsequent quantitative studies, we had begun to understand, or to develop an understanding of how people face risks and shocks in this country, amongst the poor at least, and then how they address them with certain tools. We wanted to contribute to this literature by using a new approach. So as I mentioned, we're very comfortable using survey data to inform our understanding of these 2 issues, but we hope to undertake a really in-depth qualitative study to look at, are there risks and shocks that we've missed? Are people addressing these risks and shocks in new ways that we may not have known about? And so that's what motivated this study. As I mentioned, our objective was to study really 3 basic things, but it's not they're not very basic questions. 1, which risks and shocks do households and communities face most frequently and severely, or frequently? 2, who or what do households rely upon to address these risks and shocks, and which are the most effective? 3, which specific household characteristics expose households to greater risks and shocks, and use of specific risk management methods? So that's a bit confusing, and we'll unpack that for you a little bit later. So our presentation will actually follow those 3 questions as we try to respond to them using our study. So how would we do this? As I'm sure many of you in the room are aware, qualitative studies are exhaustive, they take time. We had 12 researchers on a team that Konar led, and we chose 4 sites to do this very extensive study. We chose the sites to be representative of a few major risks that we had identified ex ante. So for instance, South Lampung is rural, but it's also close to an urban center, so it kind of gave us that dynamic. It's also a place where many farmers work on land not owned by them, so there's some tensions that we'd heard about between landowners and farmers that we hoped to understand a bit more about those dynamics. Then we also looked at Sleman. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Sleman. It's a very rural location. It sits at the base of Mount Merapi. So Mount Merapi exploded or erupted in 2012. And it therefore presented us an opportunity to look at what people do when there's a huge covariate shock, if you will. West Lombok is also a peri-urban site. There are many migrants which travel between Lombok and urban centers, and so it presented a new set of challenges there. And finally, West Sumba, it's a very rural location. People are very close to their cultural kinship groups. There's food insecurity, there's instances of horizontal conflict. So we felt that, again, that represented a completely new set of challenges potentially. And so we wanted to see, if we looked at all of these sites, there presumably would be lots of variation between them because they were very different, but we wanted to see if there were any similarities as well. So methods, I've already explained that we wanted to use this qualitative approach since it was different than a lot of the quantitative work that we've done in the past. We did do a bit of an updated quantitative analysis as well of some other survey data that we did find. But the study mainly focused on this qualitative approach, and we looked at the community and household levels. And we did a number of different things, but the main ones included, for instance, we would have long focus group discussions with key informants on risk and risk management topics. And mainly those focus group discussions were very helpful in helping us to rank different households within the community by their poverty status using a community-based approach, which led us to undertake surveys, semi-structured surveys, with about 30 household respondents in each village, with 10 being near poor, 10 being poor, and 10 being very poor, for a total of about 117 respondents. There was a few that we couldn't use in the end. We also undertook extensive household life histories and case studies to understand more concretely this dynamic between informal practices of addressing risks and formal practices of addressing risk. Now, so as I mentioned, we're going to address, the presentation is in 3 sections. So Dr. Haswinar will address the risks and shocks that we found through our study that people reported that they faced over the last 5 years. I'll go over the risk management side and the household characteristics side, and then Konar will close. Dr. Haswinar.
Thank you, Cindy. This section will look specifically on risk and shock, but before we go further on the findings, maybe it is useful to remind, maybe everybody already know, but also to remind what is the definition of risk and shocks. By risk, we refer to condition or events that potentially faced by household that could affect its income or welfare. So risk is a condition, a potential condition, which could be faced by household, and it could affect their income and welfare. And shock is more the realization of the risk. When it happens, it becomes a shock. And in this section, we will what we will discuss is the instances of reported shocks, not the risk, but the shocks that experienced by household that we interview in our field sites. And as Cindy mentioned, we use a qualitative approach and qualitative method. And usually the consequences of qualitative method, we got a lot of data and a lot of information about risk and risk management, and also a lot of variation, very different terminology for one risk, and so it's very huge data. So we think that we need to be more systematic for the data. So we group the information on risk into 2 very general categories. The first one is we call it the first category we call it covariate shocks, and the other is idiosyncratic shocks. Covariate shocks is something, events or condition which happening and affect most of the people in certain areas. And in our cases, because our study is at the village level, covariate shocks meaning the shocks is happening and affected households who live in that area. Most of all the households who live in that area. And from our finding and our field site, we find, for example, kind of covariate shock like drought. We found it in Lampung and especially in Sumba, and also a mount eruption in Merapi, in Sleman, and earthquake in Lombok, and also horizontal conflict in Sumba. And idiosyncratic shock is event or condition which is experienced or affecting only certain individual household within a community or within a village. And as we see from the table, from this table, for covariate shocks, what I already mentioned, there is earthquake, eruption, drought, horizontal conflict here. And for idiosyncratic shocks, we look at the data and emerge from the data is various kind of risks which we categorize further into the subcategories of economic shocks or risks, and then health and social relation or customary rituals. I will explain it later about the last type of shocks here. And we find that economic and health risk, if we look at the percentage at the right column, health and economic risk is the most prominent risk faced by household in our field sites. Okay, so let go further more detail into those two prominent risks that faced by household here. First is the economic shocks here. Most of the answer can be categorized into, or at least we can say that there are further subcategories of economic shocks which emerge from the qualitative data that we collected here. And as we can see in the table, lack of fund for basic daily needs is the most, all of the households that we interviewed reported that they experienced that kind of shocks. They said they have limited funds to meet their daily needs. This is an obvious, it's an obvious situation because we are studying poor household, and one defining characteristic of how a poor household is they have their income is low and they have lack of funds to meet daily needs here. But yeah, it's obvious, but we still think it's important because it's emerged from the data. But also it's important because we are very interested on how they manage to deal with this kind of risk. And the second subcategory of economic risk or shocks is high educational cost. It is also clear the tuition fee is still something is really burdensome for poor people, and also transportation cost and pocket money for the children is also something which is costly for them. And we found also that in rural areas, households with children who already have an education at the level of junior or senior high school is also have a problem with the transportation cost, because the school usually is outside of the village. So they have to go to outside the village, and in certain places, in many places like in Lampung and in Sumba, the cost of transportation to go back and forth from house to the school is quite burdensome for the parents. The third shocks which is important and reported by the household is agricultural shocks. Agricultural shocks like harvest failure, and also the fluctuation of the price of inputs. It's really something which is reported become a problem for people who work in agriculture. Agricultural shocks is also important because once it's happened, it also can affect other households which not directly work in agriculture, but because they also depend on the income from people who mostly work in agriculture, it could affect other people. Okay, the second prominent risk that we found in our studies is health risk. Yeah? And if we see the table, sickness or accident, or fatal accidents, is become a very prominent risk experienced by household for our field site. And then death and reproductive and malnutrition. We make small notes on reproductive and malnutrition problem. It is reported very low, and as you know, we go to Lombok, and Lombok is very well known as a place where malnutrition and problem related with reproduction is quite high there. High mortality is quite high. So it's quite surprising that people reported very low about the experience of malnutrition and reproduction problem. But on the other hand, if we go to Kecamatan, for example, we can see that people in Kecamatan have data, but also have opinion that this reproductive and malnutrition problem is a big problem in this area. So we think that it shows that why they reported household, not much household reported it, because their awareness about the problem and their knowledge about the problem maybe not, I don't know, it's quite low, or they don't know about that problem, so they won't report it. But the case of malnutrition and a case of reproductive problem is quite high at least at the statistical level in Kecamatan. Okay, the last this is the one that we call customary shocks. Yeah, this is one thing. This is not a kind of risk which is reported highly by our informant, but we think it's important and it's interesting. Yeah. It's important because we think that this kind of risk or shocks, customary risk or shocks, we can find it in a lot of places in Indonesia where traditional customary norm is still strong. So I think it's important, and I think that this kind of risk is also not reported in the previous survey data about risk and risk management in Indonesia. So that's why we tried a little bit to see about the risk. Yeah. First of all, we call this a lot of risk and shock that are reported by household as a customary risk because they frequently said that this kind of risk, this kind of burden is related to a customary practice or customary norm within the community. So that's why we call it customary risk or customary shocks. Yeah. And in this category, we found the most prominent is high cost of rituals, and the second is divorce and death. If we look at the table, high cost of rituals, we can find it everywhere, although it's very prominent in Sleman and West Sumba. And then divorce is in Lombok, I think, which is Lombok is dominant, and also in South Lampung. And for theft, all of it is coming from Sumba. This is a special custom there. So high cost of rituals is we are talking about ritual life cycle rituals. Basically, it is become a cost because whenever there are rituals and you are invited to the rituals, you have to contribute something, and the contributions is what we call reciprocal. So when you are invited, you give something to the host, and then when you perform a ritual, and your neighbor that or your relative will come and give contribution, something like that. So it's a reciprocal gift giving. Yeah? We can find a lot of cases of that in several areas in Indonesia. That's the ritual, the customary ritual. And for divorce, we included in customary risk because it's divorce. The high rate of divorce in Sumba in Lombok is it's strongly related to customary norm, customary practice related to gender relation there, and also to the practice of, for example, for polygamy in that area, and also related to how people see widow, negatively see the widows, and all of that case is have affect the not just the welfare and the social status of the widow, but also the income and the job, their job. That's why we put it there. And for theft, it's specific in Sumba because stealing stealing cattle or pigs from rich family, a kind of practice which is sometimes is conducted by a person who want to show disrespect to a certain prominent or rich household in the area, and or if you want to challenge them, challenge the household in the context of competition within kinship system, their kinship system, they can steal that the cattle. So a lot of people are afraid of cattle stealing there, and it could be very rookie if they steal your cattle, because it's very expensive. Even pigs also very expensive. So that's something which is reported as important risk there. So that's about the type of customary risk. And there's also an interesting question on, if we see like in customary rituals, we see the reciprocal gift giving. So the question is this customary ritual, is it a risk or is it a social insurance? Because some said that this is a risk because if you have to pay every time you have to pay for the contribution, it will be a burden for your for your income. It also will shock. But it's also a social insurance because if you pay something to your neighbor, whenever you have to go to perform a ritual, there is an assurance that you will get help from your from your neighbor or from your relatives. But and the reciprocal exchange is not involving just me and you as individual, but also involving a group of people in the context of Sumba, involving different clans. So if you need help, you can ask not just from one person, but also from several persons within the clan. So the question, is it a risk, a shock, or is an insurance? And our answer is it is both, because we are sure that this is an insurance because the network of reciprocal exchange is very important in Sumba context. For example, if you are participating in that network, it is an insurance that you can get access to resources whenever you need or whenever you face some kind of shocks or risk. But it is also risk of shocks because the timing of when you have to contribute is not certain, and it is also a burden or a risk because the cost of resources that have to be exchanged sometimes it's also become expensive and it's fluctuated. So in the past, the system is developed when in a traditional society, but at a time, I don't know when, long time ago, maybe resources that they exchange is something which is available in their environment and they can access it. For example, if I have a ritual, I have to give a rice, for example. Because rice, everybody has rice, right? But the more the community is depending on market to get some resources, it becomes more, they have to pay for the goods that have to be exchanged among them. And whenever you have paid, there become a problem because in the community there are poor household, there are rich, but there are all a poor household that cannot afford to buy the thing. That's why they said it's a problem. You want to continue? Other thing, we already mentioned that we found several kinds of risk and a prominent risk, the subcategory of risk. Another thing which is we think it is important is that most of the household reported that they are not only experience the risk once. Each household experience several risks in a period of time, and then sometimes they experience it very quickly in a very short time, and that situation is very has significantly affect their welfare and their income. We used two examples for that from South Lampung. It's from a near poor household. His name Pak Jajang is a pseudonym. One day he got a severe stroke, but when he got stroke, it happened coincided with a long drought in Lampung. He had a piece of land where he has a sawah, but because of drought, he experienced heart failure, and then also, of course, because the heart failure, the income is reducing significantly, and while he's sick, his wife worked as a housekeeper in the town in Lampung, but the income is not enough because they have to pay for Pak Jajang's treatment and also other necessities, and because it is not enough, but Pak Jajang is still sick and have to be treated, they were forced to sell their land to cover for the cost. And in Lampung context, selling land is very because as a farmer, if you don't have land, you have to rent the land, and the cost is very expensive. And if you can rent the land, you have to be farm labor, and the income is not enough as well. And if you need more income, you have to go to the town and work something at town. That's Pak Jajang, yeah. And then in Sleman, we take a sample of Ibu Tini. She worked as a sand miner. A lot of people, men and women, working as a sand miner. They take sand from the river nearby the village. The river coming from the Mount Merapi, bring a lot of sand there. So they and it's a very good job because every day, if they took sand, they can got 35 to 50,000 rupiah per day, and for a Sleman context, it's very significant. So they have cash money, and for food they just blend it in their own field and garden. So Ibu Tini worked as a sand miner, but she quit her job because she is pregnant, and she had to undergo a cesarean section, and because she don't have a jam kesmas or jam persal, she had to pay for 1.5 million. It's a big number for in the context of Sleman. And shortly after her surgery, she has to back to work because, I don't know, in the story that we got from the field, her husband is, what they go? Is lazy. He doesn't want to work. He just work, but the income is very, very low. Something like that. So Botini have to work hard for that. So she cannot wait for to be fully recovered. She have to start work again. But then apa namanya? Stitches is open due to the heavy lifting. They don't just apa namanya? Lift sand, but sometimes a big stone, you know, because it's good to sell. So she have to take rest again, and but because she really needs apa namanya the income, and then she have to work again, but her capacity to work is quite limited because it's heavy work, and her condition is not allowed to work too hard. And on top of that, the government, the local government, make new rules. They are not allowing people to take sands from the river because when Merapi erupted, a lot of lahar dingin itu bringing the sand there, and then it is covering the river. Not just with sand, but also with big stones, and government said, oh, we have to clean the river, and they said the program is normalisasi kali, ya, jadi river normalization, they call it that. They close the river, and people cannot take the sand, and then that's really give a significant impact for people who depend on their income from the sand mining. Okay. Yeah, that's some of our finding about the risk, and then Cindy will continue with how households manage those kind of risks.
Okay, so I know Ibu Stacy will probably look at us soon, and we have 3 more sections to go over, so I'll try to go through them a bit quickly. But of course, Pak Onar just went over the risks and shocks that we found through the survey, and of course we asked them how they address those risks and shocks. In the same way that Pak Onar went over the main way that we categorized risks and shocks in the first section, we also of course had to categorize different response mechanisms. There's 2 main ones. On the informal side and the formal side, there's several subcategories, but the 2 main ones are informal and formal. And as you can probably guess from the title of the paper, informal we are most curious about, and we go into at greater length in our paper. On the informal side, there's 3 main categories that we found: self-reliance, social, and market-based. So what do we mean by each of those? On the self-reliant side, when in speaking about this with Konar, I'm making a joke, and I was saying, okay, let's say that my shock is that you know, I lose my job. Let's say I don't do a good job in this presentation, so I lose my job. So that's my shock. How would I use informal risk tools to address that? So on the self-reliant side, that just means that people draw down the assets that they have. So I, you know, experience this loss of a job, so I sell, you know, whatever assets that I own so that I can save for this rainy day. On the social side, social IRM, we conceive of it as the resources that are exchanged between family, friends, people that you know personally. I have this shock to my income stream, so I'll go to my Ibu, or I'll go to Pak Onar, or you know, someone that I work with and know deeply. Those are the resources that we exchange amongst friends and neighbors in a social setting. market-based IRM is kind of something that we felt was particularly unique perhaps to the communities that we were working in that there's some exchanges that have a commercial dimension. So I lose my job, I go to a local store and I get a loan and they charge interest on that loan, but it's not regulated by any policies or legal framework. So it's under the table, but it still has this market dimension. So we termed that a market-based mechanism. So those are the three main informal types. Formal risk management is everything that has formal regulations to describe its function. So we found two main types. On the public assistance side, it's everything that the poverty team is really concerned about, social assistance. So public assistance is any resources that are disseminated by governments, either at the central level, and we tend to think of the major 5 programs, PKH, the Conditional Cash Transfer Program, BLSM, which is the Direct Cash Transfer Program, BSM, which is the Scholarships for the Poor, the Ruskin Program, which is Free Rice for the Poor, and Jamkesmach, which is the health insurance for the poor program. And then there's also, in our study, we found that there's a whole range of different subnational government actions to address various risks. On the formal risk management side, we also have commercial risk management, which is actual loans that you would get from a bank or a commercial institution. Okay, so clearly, I'll just stand so that we can go over this. Clearly, we were very keen to know how people actually responded to the risks and shocks that they faced. So we took all of the different risk management tools that they reported and tried to divide them between the tools that were used to address covariate shocks and the tools that were used to address idiosyncratic shocks. Quickly, and we'll go over it in more detail later, on the covariate shock side, so the covariate shocks again are earthquakes, they're droughts, they're community-wide shocks. So here we find that formal risk management actually plays an important role. So these are social assistance programs. We'll see later that when we looked at it a bit more deeply, a lot of this was actually subnational government programs, so let's say local government initiatives in Sleman that wanted to help support people's livelihoods after the eruption. The IRM, on the other hand, we see is the most dominant, essentially. So people relied to a significant extent on their own resources. About 40% of people just relied on the assets that they had themselves. And then a quarter of people relied on their friends, family, and neighbors. Of course, as we mentioned, for covariate shocks, or we'll mention actually in the future, social IRM is actually usually quite limited because everyone is experiencing the shock at the same time as you are. One thing worth noting, though, is that both for the idiosyncratic side and the covariate side, IRM is in yellow here. So if you add up all the IRM resources that are used, it's about double the formal risk management side. So people are using IRM significantly to address both covariate and idiosyncratic shocks. So why is this a problem? So, when going into this analysis with Konar, I thought, well, I also use informal resources to address any shocks that I might face. It's easy to go to friends, it's easy to use and draw down on your own resources. But the problem is that both in the Indonesian context and also more globally, people understand that IRM for risk management for poor households is it's usually largely inadequate, and it helps the vicious cycle of poverty continue, essentially. So we know that within poor communities, the economic status of risk management providers and receivers is just generally the same. So I might ask Bakonar as my colleague for risk management resources. He might ask his family and friends, and we're all in the same socioeconomic group, essentially. Which means that if you do have a covariate shock or a significant idiosyncratic shock, that usually means that those resources are drawn down more quickly. Echoing the World Development Report for 2014, which is on risk and vulnerability, they also drove home this point, and it was echoed in our study results, that informal resources, again, as I mentioned, the covariate shocks, it's hard to address community-wide shocks when you're using these informal resources, or for really significant shocks, they're usually not sufficient either. And so that's why you see in something like this, where we took the frequency of use of each of these types per household, you'll see that I mean, people, for idiosyncratic economic shocks, for instance, which Fakon already mentioned is the most significant, people are not just going to the IRM, they're also going to anything else that they can find. I mean, the IRM resources might be your first channel for help and support to address these risks, but it's not everything, and people are essentially going to every channel that they can find in order to manage the risks that they face. Why else is IRM not usually adequate? So we asked people, when did they prepare or deal with the shocks that they reported? So we think of dealing with shocks as either doing it before or doing it after, so ex ante or ex post. If you're trying to address a shock before you face it, you're usually avoiding it or mitigating its impact. So you're taking steps. For me, if I don't want to lose my job, I would, work more or work better. If you're doing actions ex post, you cope with them. So, if someone were to lose their job, let's say, or someone in their family has suffered a sickness or illness, you scramble to deal with it afterwards. Coping is generally worse because it's more costly. And the way that you deal with the stress of the shock is usually not as good. So it's usually better if you avoid it or mitigate it, of course. But the problem with avoidance and mitigation is that it's tough to do. And we know, because we looked at the distribution of when people were using the risk management tools that they used, we know that 36% of the time they were using it as a self-reliance tool after, and essentially all of the activities that they were doing were after the shock event, which is not as helpful as it would have been had they avoided or mitigated it. Okay, so we've talked about how IRM is what people do, but it's not the best way to address risks or shocks. It's just what's most frequently done. So then we looked at the role of public assistance in the 4 villages that we were studying, and we wanted to see the extent to which people were actually using public assistance tools. So I mentioned that we did find incidents of people using subnational FRM, and these are just the national programs. But even looking at just the national programs, for instance, we find that of the households that we surveyed, nearly 100% of them are using Ruskin. And nearly 100% of them are using Ruskin for economic purposes. So they're using them to address the economic shocks that they face. Second most frequent is Jamkesmas. Now, if you looked at this chart, you'd say, okay, well, at least they have resources at their disposal when they're facing these shocks. They must be fine. The problem with it is, though, that the actual benefits received through these programs are marginal at best. For instance, with Ruskin, the intention is that households would receive 15 kilograms per month. They actually, because of this bagirata and community sharing, they actually receive about 4 kilograms of actual benefit per month. So that doesn't go a long way when households are consuming 35 kilograms. This 4 kilograms that they receive is not going a long way to address the economic concerns that they face. Jamkesmas, similarly, there's pretty wide coverage, but we found that people didn't really know what their benefits were, that they faced supply-side constraints. For instance, they weren't getting their claims processed in time. So they reported using it at least once, but it's unclear to the extent to which it actually helped them address the shocks that they faced. So we've talked about how FRM is it's used during natural disasters. People say that they use it for economic purposes as well, but there are issues of access. So beyond just the low benefit that people actually receive. There are also other issues that some groups might not be receiving FRM as much as others. For instance, in the case of Sleman, we talked about how after the eruption of Mount Merapi, there was some local government action. They were trying to support livelihood replacement. So they had a lot of people in Sleman had cattle before the eruption. They lost that cattle during the eruption, and so the government wanted to come back and replace the cattle of the people that had the cattle. But the problem is that the very poor didn't own cattle, so they essentially weren't supported in terms of their livelihood needs. Instead, a lot of the poor people in the surrounding communities were grass collectors. And so, of course, in an eruption, all the grasses were destroyed. So not only were their livelihoods directly destroyed, but they also weren't receiving this extra support from the government. So a lot of people were actually quite upset about that. Okay, so on household characteristics, I know Stacey is going to get mad at us, but I'll go through it quickly as well. So again, we've talked about on the risk side and the shock side what things were quite significant, and then on the risk management side, the ways in which people chose to address them. On the household characteristics side, we were asking the question, look, it's great that we know the risks and shocks that people face and the risk management tools that they use. Are there differences between households, though? So is a female-headed household, for instance, going to face a separate set of risks and shocks than a male-headed household might? Will that female-headed household be able to access FRM at greater or less rates? These are the kinds of questions that we then began to ask. So our hypothesis was that some households with specific characteristics, if you will, would face different risks and shocks and would use different tools to address those shocks. We created a database to match the patterns with one another based on these household characteristics. And we looked at a whole range of different characteristics, but we'll just show you a sample of them now. So I actually tried to animate this, so I'm sorry it's so busy. But I'll just go through them one by one. So on the covariate shock side, so this is us looking at the household characteristic of poverty status. So I mentioned that using PPLS and community rankings, we divided our sample up into households that were very poor, so under the official poverty line, and near poor. And we looked at, we're only going to really talk about the risk management side, but the risks and shocks side is developed further in this paper. But on the risk management side, we find a few very interesting things. So for instance, we talked about FRM being an option that the poor could use to manage their risks. But we find when we actually analyze it by poverty status that the very poor are actually accessing FRM resources much less than the near poor. So this is partially driven by these local government initiatives that don't seem to be as sensitive to the needs of the very poor. But it's still so significant that we were questioning that. We also find that perhaps as a result, the very poor is in red, are very reliant on social resources. So they're very reliant on their friends and neighbors. And we hypothesized from the interviews that we had that perhaps it was because they weren't accessing the FRM that they were forced to go to their friends and neighbors at a higher rate. On the idiosyncratic economic side, so these are, they lacked daily funds for daily use. They the whole range of different economic challenges, which is the most prevalent. We find that, like I mentioned before, everyone is accessing FRM, right? It's like 100%, which is, if you looked at this, you'd said, great, they actually have recourse when they're facing a problem. Of course, all of that 100% practically is Ruskin. So when we've already talked about how Ruskin, it seems like people are getting such a low benefit that even though they're accessing it at least once, it's not actually helping them to address the shocks that they face. The near poor have some more resources to rely upon. So again, self-reliance, they're accessing their own resources slightly more, which is what we would expect as well. On the idiosyncratic health side, we have that we thought it was quite interesting to look at, again, the case of FRM. So for health, we think of junk mas or associated products. And we find that, again, the very poor are accessing it much less than the health side, and we think that it probably could be due to lack of socialization, lack of knowledge about how to access these programs. In fact, we have several cases where people said, I didn't have access to Jean Persal, so I had to pay 1.5 million. I had to, I didn't have access to XYZ, so I had to pay. And then later I got it, or later I figured out that I could have accessed this tool. On the customary side, we found it quite interesting as well. So this is, again, the ritual side. The very poor rely on their own assets and social assets to a great extent, mainly because people, when there are rituals that are faced, they do allow the poor to, perhaps not, if they want to participate, not participate by giving the higher cost items. Maybe very poor households can clean up after the ritual is performed. So there are certain ways that the community allows the very poor to cope with those shocks. Okay, we also looked at female-headed households, which we wondered if there was much differences in how they experienced shocks as well. So we're only presenting two because the others, there was less variation between male-headed households and female-headed households. So we see on the covariate shock side, so in the case of a drought, let's say, female-headed households, the FRM side, I'll explain because it's a bit interesting, but we see that the female-headed households are actually accessing the FRM at lower rates than male-headed households. So in our targeting work that the poverty team has done previously, we know actually that female-headed households at a national level, for national programs, actually receive more social assistance than male-headed households. There are certain programs that are targeted at women and targeted at female-headed households at a national level. But this could either be sample size problems, or I think it reflects some of these local programs that are going towards covering covariate risks, actually. So we are exploring that with a bit more detail. On the IRM social side, we see that female-headed households rely on their friends and neighbors much more than male-headed households, actually. And through some of the interviews that we conducted, people were saying that, if a household is led by a female, we think that they're more deserving of our support at the time that they have a shock. So they're able to access those resources with a bit more facility than male-headed households. So that was an interesting finding as well. On the customary side, we have similarly, it's the same sort of dynamics taking place, that female-headed households are accessing the IRM social at higher rates than male-headed households, and it could again be because people understand that this type of household might be at a disadvantage in terms of gaining income, and so support them with resource flows a bit more. Okay, and then we also looked at large households, so households that have 5 or more members. Oftentimes it's someone's adopted cousins living in the house, or your grandparents, or the elderly. The large households. It was about evenly split actually. In our sample, we had half the households that were large and half that were 5 or less. So we wanted to see what they experienced. So for covariate shocks and customary shocks, it was more unique than in other instances. And for covariate shocks, we found that essentially the FRM is the questionable one, where large households are accessing FRM at much lower rates. And it's a question because you would think that large households have less resources, and so they should be able to access these FRM resources at higher rates. Of course, because of problems with design at the local level, these subnational schemes, we suspect that that's causing this discrepancy in the rates at which both small and large households access these resources. On the customary side, we have that large households in yellow are, they're relying on their resources more because presumably they have to. And on the social side, they're accessing the resources of friends and neighbors much more as well. Presumably because they have, they're larger households and have fewer resources, so have to.
Okay. We are on time, on schedule, so with that, I would like to conclude our session today, the FKP, and this will be the last session, am I right, Astrid? So this is the last session hosted by the World Bank for this month, because Forum Kajian Pembangunan will continue next month in CSIS office. So thank you very much all for coming, for your questions, comments, and support. And maybe we see you again in another FKP event.